All right, so here we go. Thank you very much, Ana, for being here. And, well, Ana Sanchez-Colberg is a Puerto Rican transdisciplinary artist working internationally. Her trajectory begins in choreography and dance. She established theater and corps in 1989 to 2009 to now, to the moment, right? Still there. And
Still there.
and has a track record of award-winning works created and performed in over 40 cities worldwide. Since 2016, she moves fully into non-stage, multidisciplinary works based on experimentation with generative compositional rules to create new forms of collaborative and participatory contemporary art. The works defy categorization as they bring together elements of fine and visual art, audio composition, movement, photography, and film, live documentation in works that question the relationship between art institutions, the art object, and the subjects involved in the creation and reception. A long track a long track record of work exploring the relationship between music, sound, movement, and dance. Two other projects come to mind, she said. Mahler 5th and 45, 46, 47, all based on improvisation, open composition modes with varying degrees of openness in the score. So thank you very much for being here, Anna.
Pleasure.
Well,
I try not to move. I tend to, being a dancer, I tend to move a lot in these things and I forget it gets blurry. I'll try to see still.
Well, first of all, right, I found you because of the article you wrote with Dimitris Karalis, Moving Sound, New Relationships Between Contemporary Dance and Music in Improvisation. That's what I've been studying, and it's great to being able to have this contact with you. It's great. It's gonna be it's a great contact. It's a great connection. So I have some questions for you. The first one would be, how has your interest about free improvisation started? And what's your connection to improvisation in dance, music, and performing arts?
How should I start? Improvisation, as with many contemporary choreographers, improvisation exists in contemporary choreography, and I'm using the word contemporary as opposed to modern, which would be something more related to the modernist approaches in the United States. My work has been primarily in Europe, so I'm really using the word contemporary. Mm-hmm. And we know that in the notion of contemporary aesthetic processes, productions, methodologies, improvisation exists in many layers. We know that a process of devising, which is quite central to contemporary choreography, particularly because so much of it is devised work with companies, there is an element of improvisation at its most basic. Fine, but we're not interested in that. For me, improvisation became important because of two specific aspects of my work. The first one is that I come through very strange ways. I see myself as being part of the Lab and Tanztheater heritage. It doesn't mean that I have worked with people in Germany. Actually, I did. They were the subject of my research. But Tanztheater, for me, was very important. Tanztheater, and this is of the German Tanztheater kind, was for me an important bridge to leave ballet and move into contemporary dance without going through the modernist American model. The modernist model did not interest me. Coming from Puerto Rico, I'm very opinionated. Coming from Puerto Rico, Graham doesn't make sense. Limon, a little bit, but it doesn't make sense. So I was really looking for something that, as a Puerto Rican artist, with the particularities of having been raised in Puerto Rico, would make sense. And Tanzteatro, with its hybridity, its questioning of tradition, made sense. So for me, it was a clean break from ballet into Tanzteatro, but I didn't want to deal with technique. It's going to come to improvisation. I didn't want to deal with dance as a language, the language of technique, because of the break from the ballet tradition. So I had to explore other ways. And this is where Tanzteatro comes in. We know that Tanzteatro is heavily devised. We know that from the work of Pina, but also the work of other people. Everybody speaks of Pina, but I always remind people there are many German Tanzteatro artists of the same generation. She just happened to have a fantastic marketing and publicity machinery behind her.
Pina Bausch.
But Susanna Linke, Gerhard Bohmer, Eichel Hoffmann, we know that there is a generation of Tanzteatro artists. So for me, that was really interesting. It's going to connect to improvisation, but for me, one of the things that I learned from Tanzteatro was the relationship between bodies and spaces. The moment you shift away from dance as a language, then dance is, I'm going to simplify, about body in a particular space, and the conditions of that space is what generates movement. So in a modernist version, movement is the language to inscribe the open page, blank page of the stage. Not so much in my case. Body in a space which is never blank. Look at how complex Tanzteatro environments are. Yeah?
Yes.
Is what leads to humans to behave in a particular way. Yeah, and that behavior is perhaps why people think of Tanzteatro as being dramatic. And there's an essay about the origins of physical theater where I say, like physical theater, Tanzteatro is not because it mixes dance and drama. It's because the moment that you set the relationship of a body acting in space, philosophy calls that agonistic, and agonistic is the essence of drama. Okay,
exactly.
It's going to link. We could go back to Greek opera, which is where the link to the work with Dimitris Karalis comes in, but we're going to put that on hold. Where does then sound, music, and improvisation comes in? For me, probably because I'm from Puerto Rico, yeah, going back to a kind of aesthetic that makes political in the personal political, in the relationship of self and world. This is where Puerto Rico comes into Tanzteatro. To be Puerto Rican is to be immersed in sound from the day you are born.
I can imagine.
Sound, and particularly in the island, and this is a conflict of being an immigrant in Europe, sound which is constant. I never understood the myth of silence of Europe.
Yeah, it's incredible.
The myth of silence, the highly political, problematic, should I say colonizing problem of the northern revering of silence in relation to the global south. So there is no silence in Puerto Rico, even at night. We have something beautiful called coqui, which is this small. It only lives on the island, is a frog that sounds so loud. It's this big, so small that it lives in the water that gets trapped in between aloe type. So, yeah, you cannot take it out of the island. It dies. They've tried, doesn't work. But it's called coqui.
They tried.
Yeah, they tried. They have tried. They tried to take it to Hawaii because it was similar. Yeah, it dies.
Poor frog.
Poor frog. But it's this big, which I love it. It's this big and so noisy. You can see why it is the nation's emblematic animal. It's a coqui. Small, green. It dies if you take it out of the island, and it's so noisy. So before, part of what we're responding to and part of our relationship to body and space is a relationship that is always sonic. It is sonic both as the sound of the environment, but also sonic because also, as you know, we come from an island where the rhythms of music are extraordinarily complex. You do learn to dance from the moment you're young. Everybody knows salsa. It is not a question of race. If you're Puerto Rican, you know salsa.
Yeah.
And you argue with merengue coming from Dominican Republic. And of course, we have the strong inheritance from the Afro-Cuban rhythms in the island. So we have two things. We have a nature environment, which never is silenced, and we have the musical forms. Yeah. So this is the sound. We have the sonic, which is always there, and the language. See my language, the speed, the language, the rhythm, the language. It comes out with hands immediately.
Yes.
So we have the sonic, which is very complex, and that sonic also has the musical, which is also very complex. So that's where my choreography came in. For me, choreography, when I choreographed, the sonic, both sonic and musical, was actually the starting point. Not to compose music for the dance in the traditional way, but that the first element that I considered coming into the stage was the sonic.
Yes.
And how the sonic was going to affect the embodied. And then from that, we could start speaking about movement and whatever was produced to create the work. And that has always been there from the beginning. My first piece in 1989 was something called Alice, 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 Are You a Child or a Teetotaler? I like long titles on purpose. In which we created a dance theater version of Alice in Wonderland. And I worked with this amazing percussionist called Paul Pavey to create a score, which ended up being an operatic singing score on stage. It won an award, and this was at the Place Theatre in London in another lifetime. And it was that voice became important. It was live, it was voice and cello and percussionist. There was always a dialogue within music and dancers, musicians and dancers. So although it was scored, it always acknowledged, and this is where improvisation begins to come in, although it was scored, it always acknowledged the openness of that relationship when it was on stage by version of being live. Yeah, so you can see how music was always there, the sonic was always there, and because of Tanztheater and this question with environment as the motivation, space-body relationship as the motivation for the genesis of movement, improvisation began to sneak in. So I've always worked with close composer colleagues, and in fact, we always think of the work as being co-created, you know. That's why the word theater encore, I didn't want my name in the company. It was always an understanding that the work was, you know, playing with the sonic. Playing with the sonic. Encore, encore.
I like the name.
In company. I know.
Great.
I'll tell you one thing that Lord Newson said about my name was like, you know, Anna, after DV8, Theater and Corps is the best company name I've ever known. I'm like, thank you, Lloyd. In another lifetime in London.
It's a great name.
I know. It's very uncle. So improvisation enters fully as a process of taking that proposal of body space to its extreme. It became a logical consequence. If I'm dealing with the space, with the stage as moving more and more away from the representational, if this stage, still on stage, is really an environment, and the sound is an environment, and it is meant to be treated as a real body space relationship, then what we call improvisation began to happen. Because it was really both the music and the dance, musicians and dance, the sound and the dance, you know, people and objects responding to that concept of environmental action, you know, as a social practice, so to speak, happening on stage in relation to dancers and sound. And that began to evolve in many ways. And that's some of the pieces that I spoke to you about. We do something called Mahler's Fifth with an amazing composer, Pedro Gomez Egaña. I don't know what happens to composers that I work with. They all move to visual arts. Pedro is now in
Really?
Oslo, being a beautiful sculptor.
Wow.
You can Google him, Pedro Gomez Egaña. We're
I
still
will.
in touch. And we decided to, because the Mahler Foundation and the Vienna Institute wanted us to make a piece about Mahler's 100th anniversary, I think it was, something like that. But have you ever listened to Mahler? It's undanceable. It's undanceable because it is so complete. Why would you put a body inside a Mahler sonic environment? It's redundant. So we started making a joke. It's like, okay, it's Mahler's fifth. We're going to divide Mahler into 5. So
Okay.
using the Fifth Symphony as a methodology. So we studied the methodology of Mahler and created 5 sections based on the Mahler's Fifth Symphony methodology, but turning it into open graphic score. So there was a score, but it was quite open. It was open. And this is, we can argue later on. I do take Peter Gay's position that there's no such thing as free improvisation. Which it's one of the things that we start in the essay. So we all had, and we started dealing with emergent systems. It's, improvisation in music and dance begins to, for me, it immediately touches upon notions of emergent systems, where we had clusters, the logotypes, the logarithms, whatever you want to call it. And what happened on stage was the activation of those prototypes, whatever, into what the composition would become. So there was improvisation, but we still had the genetic code, so to speak, that was entering into the stage to then become the composition. And I was trying to find the graphic scores, which I have, but I will have to email them to you. And then after 145, 46, 47, which was really, prior to Moving Sounds, was the real collaboration with sound. That was more sound and music with Kyriakos Spirou, who has also become a curator of fine arts, really immersing ourselves in a studio for a week, testing the effect of sound in my body, impossible sounds that make my neck paralyzed, and how I had to negotiate an environment of sound. And that, and he created all these beautiful graphic scores, really finding the common tasks between my improvisation and the music improvisation. So we collaborated not by the sonic environment, but by generating tasks that were comparable and see what that would generate as an improvisation of sound and music in the space. So the collaboration came at a point of methodology, which was, in many ways, a preamble to what then will happen more in music, since you were dealing with jazz music, jazz tradition with the work with Dimitri. So that is me. And how did we get from
Great.
So it's always been there. I think that's a very long answer to the evolution of the broad question of dance, movement, sound, and improvisation, which is broad.
I know you mentioned Merce Cunningham and John Cage and how they kind of do different things, right, at the same time. But then there's a question over here, which is maybe the point of my thesis, which is, do you feel that music can interfere in a dancer's movements, or should it interfere? And the other way around, like, which relations can come up between movement and sound in a free improvisation performance?
It's almost yes to both questions. It's a matter to what level do you want to see how they affect each other. Part of the work with Kyriakos, which informs the theoretical part of choreography in the Moving Sounds essay, has to do with the big word phenomenology. The moment you're dealing with a body in space, you're dealing with questions of embodiment, and the critical discourse of that is embodiment. So because I was I'm in a studio and we're testing, it's called 45, 46, 47, the unbearable. Not because I was dramatizing any kind of psychological unbearableness. It's not. I always play with people thinking that they know what the title is about, and they're like, well, what does that have to do with anything? But actually, it was the beginning of the crisis here in Greece in 2009. Although it took us almost a year to make that work public. And I'm very informed by the philosophy of Jean-Luc Nancy in both in sound and embodiment and notions of how do we live together in this world.
Who?
Jean-Luc Nancy. He's still alive and well, one of those 1960s philosophers with Lefebvre and all those guys who really informed, really inform experimental arts practices. And Nancy speaks of listening and touching into the darkness out in order to find a way out of crisis. And he's writing this in 1999, so he was almost prophetic of what we found ourselves in 2010. So it was actually that notion of crisis which I was exploring in something that I called 45, 46, 47, the unbearable. And the crisis, again, because I was seeing as a metaphor for the environment, was I asked Kyriakos to put me in 3 minutes of an impossible sound.
Wow.
And we researched what that impossible sound was, and it is so high pitched that you almost stop listening to it.
That's crazy.
And going to answer your question, and I am standing in the middle of the space at Kinetida studio here that unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. And this muscle gets tightened.
Wow.
And you don't want to move. The pain is so much that there's no dancing, Swan Lake at 3 to that. And then I realized that the moment you start doing this, because the sound was directed in the speakers, I can actually control the effect of the sound in my body. So from that point, and we even had to research how long could we listen to that sound before making ourselves deaf. I have had tinnitus since then, but I love it. No. It's this insane things that I probably had tinnitus because I've had from a child, but I always joke that I had tinnitus.
What do you have from that?
Constant tinnitus, the sound that you can't switch off.
Really?
Yeah, so I'm never in silence. No, I'm never in silence, which is great.
Which is
great. You, I would have such a hard time being a Buddhist nun, although I would love to become a Buddhist nun because I'm never in silence. Oh, sorry, I don't mean that disrespectful. I'm just
it's okay.
Just joyful in life, I guess. So going back to what you were saying, I began to see that I was the one who can navigate my way out of the crisis by my movement. So that was the trigger. The piece ended up lasting about 35 minutes. Of course, we then shifted. Then other metaphors for crisis began to happen: walls, floors, caves. So all these working metaphors began to happen in terms of spatial volume and spatial relationship that stemmed from that first impossible sound that made movement possible as a way to navigate out of the crisis. So yes, that's one very geeky moment. If you look at phenomenology, in which we know that what we hear without noticing affects motion. And if what we hear without noticing affects motion, then of course what we hear will affect dance. And for me, that is very, very interesting, because one of the worst things that has happened to dance is to accept full-on Barthes' methodology of film into the discourse of dance. A film is frame and a film is visual. And remember, at that time, sound in film had not been explored to the same degree that we now know. But dance is not that. Dance is three-dimensional and it is sonic. So whenever people say, but dance is absorbed through the eyes, I go methodological glitch. I'm going to take your degree away. And this is said by people who are PhDs from Routledge publications, etc., etc. No, the moment you have a live performance, sound, and this is where Nancy comes in, viewing, you can close your eyelids and stop seeing. You cannot shut off sound.
Yeah.
And the moment you cannot shut off sound, we need to stop and review all our understanding of what happens when you are engaged with the performing arts that is actually then sonically, somatically and sonically stronger than visual and somatic, because how many dancers dance with their eyes closed? So you see, we have a whole understanding of the language of dance, of how dance makes sense because of the visual, because of the moving pictures. And I go like, eh.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an experiment that Dimitris has done. Many people have done it, which is he takes the YouTube of Swan Lake and he puts different musics to it. And it does change what you see. What makes it funny, what does not. It's the same. It's still Swan Lake, the Act 3 by,
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's a very simple thing, but the whole understanding of sound and choreography needs to be reviewed because it really shows that we have created a discourse of how dance operates based on a visuality that maybe made sense in the 1930s. Actually, Barthes wrote a little bit later on, 1950s, but it's no longer relevant. So yes. Mm-hmm. My work has been very much about exploring sound as a somatic thing. What does it do? The immediate analog response that happened, this happens, which is what happens in most free improvisations, is that analog. This happens, I do the same. Mm-hmm. But the more complex improvisation, where I know that actually for whatever trigger I happen, which is where improvisation becomes open composition, where the trigger in this instrument actually triggers a variety of possible responses, not just papa, mm-hmm. da-da, but da-da. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that for me is really interesting and will make us understand what happens on stage differently, including ballet.
Mm-hmm. As a musician, sometimes I try to play the dance. Is it possible to get inspiration on movements and play sound out of it, based on movement?
Now let's come to moving sounds. Moving sounds already had one existence prior to me coming into the project. At that moment, Dimitris and Yannis Casetas, Dimitris Karalis and Yannis Casetas, were working with dancers in what, I'm going to sound critical, but it's in the history books of the project, in what they understood as a collaboration between dance and music. With Dimitris' proposal, he's quite a classicist, with Dimitris' proposal that music theory, music forms, pitch, tempo, da 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 da. If dancers knew that, they would be able to respond to music in a more complex way. In the previous version, we encountered a challenge, and the challenge was done by the dancers who said to him, this is not a collaboration. We are learning music. You're telling us that we need to be more varied, and why is that not the music leading the dance? Yeah. And I witnessed that process because I had collaborated with Dimitris in a circus piece in Stockholm and other things, and I just came in to witness, and I went like, Dimitris, you're both right. You are right in proposing that there's a complexity that is being missed. I had already done all these projects that I had mentioned to you, but I also understand the dancer's perspective that this is being led by the music. And if they were musicians who didn't know dance, we must say this, if you knew the history of dance relationship to music, this argument has happened before. Mm-hmm. So this is, in a good way, this is a productive meeting. And that's when I come in with a proposal. Your missing link is Laban movement theory. No, Laban notation. Laban has many things. This is not Laban notation. Mm-hmm. This is Laban effort and choreotics. Really the understanding of what he called the musicality of the body in motion, in a way that when you see the body moving, it is like could be seen as a three-dimensional chromatic score. And Laban actually, it's just that nobody reads that. Everybody thinks that Laban is old-fashioned. Everybody says that Laban is a Nazi and all that debate, which is highly problematic, and Laban has been forgotten. I'm not going to enter into that debate. I've made my peace with Laban. And Laban actually looks at the body in motion and draws parallels, which now phenomenology has told us, phenomenology of sound has told us is true. Laban is the one who proposes certain affinities with musical structures and what he calls effort factors, movement factors. And he speaks of duration, not timing. For him, metric is something else, of duration. Mm-hmm. And the duration can be quick or sustained. He doesn't say fast or slow. He says the nature of the experience of the time duration. Laban is all about the experience of the dancer, of certain qualities which can be given structural language. He doesn't create a structure that he then imposes on the dancer. He says weight, which is the up and down. We tend to think of things being lighter and higher and things being heavier. He says stark, more energy as they go down. Mm-hmm. Well, phenomenology now tells you that when we hear a flute going, bodies will go, mm-hmm. And when you go dum, 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 we will go dum, dum, dum. Mm-hmm. That's the mimetic, yeah?
Yes.
But the mimetic is not taught, yeah? Mm-hmm. The mimetic is now something that we understand as primary metaphors. It's beautiful, isn't it? This is phenomenology. There are some primary metaphors between the sonic and the somatic. I can give you, it's in the bibliography of moving sound. I brought that to moving sounds. Yeah. And that's where, and then I said, okay, not only am I bringing you this, which is, I think could be the next development, I'm going to take it to the best dancers that I can think of, and they're ballet dancers, not contemporary dancers, because ballet dancers will have an understanding of dealing with music, and they will have an understanding of what it means to be following score, and they will have an understanding of the music, and they will therefore appreciate how your proposal coming from musical structure can be liberating and open up the door towards improvisation. So moving sounds is lovely, but moving sounds has to be contextualized with the previous experience of the dancers, the previous experience of the musicians, etc. So all that to say, can we read the dance? Yes. But in the complex thing that is the body in motion, what are we looking at to transfer into the sonic? Because if you look at dancers are moving, creating shapes. Well, that gives you a score. If you look at the tension, that gives you this kind of score. You know, there are these scores for line, energy scores. Yeah. So yes, a musician can look at a dance and be inspired by it. And there are also the metaphors of reading the body, happy, sad, you know, but if you move away from the representation of emotion, and so much of dance and music improvisation is at the emotion without going anywhere near, don't get me going on memory. Emotion and memory, my two pet hates.
Yeah, there's a question
really
about
improvising again on a memory of childhood. Sorry, I'm getting old, I'm being brutal.
Yeah, actually, anyway, there's a question about that later.
So yes, I think a musician can be inspired, and in many ways, that's what moving sound did, particularly for the musicians. And I think some of the dancers said that. Am I following? Some of the musicians said that. Some of the quotes from the musicians, they were so amazed because they were like, suddenly realized it's not just following this. Am I looking at the hand? Am I looking at the torso? Because the hand can be going light, but the hand is going light, but the back. Remember, a body can have a double rhythm.
Exactly.
Not ballet. Ballet works on one rhythm, but this is where German Tanztheater comes in. The work of Mary Wegmann is where my teacher Helmut comes from, and that's my connection to the German technique. When you do Wegmann's work, which is very percussive as well, you're learning to carry 2 or 3 rhythms in your body. It takes a while. So your hand is doing a 2-3 while your foot is doing a 4-4, something similar to what a drummer has to learn to coordinate multiplicity of rhythms. Not many dancers can do that. Dancers tend to organize the body into one dominant rhythm. So that's what I'm saying. What are you looking at? In the concept of the partiture, we're going to use the partiture metaphor. If you're looking at the dance as a kind of partiture, what are we looking at in order to be inspired to do that? Can I show you something? Hannah, a minute. Can you let
yeah.
no,
Yeah.
Because it answers
you
that
froze
question.
for a bit. You froze for a bit, but now you're back. Yeah, go ahead.
Back?
Yeah,
Hannah,
no, go ahead.
Let me, I just want to show you something because it
course.
answers that question. I need to open the PDF.
Go ahead.
Athens can be tricky. Oh, don't tell me I don't have the scores here. No, I'm gonna have to owe you. You see, because my computer, I'm gonna stop sharing. I have to owe you that one because I was looking, then I realized my drivers need updated and I need to find.
Sorry.
One of the things that Kyriakos did in The Impossible was actually look at me and how I was moving and transform that. Oh, but I can show you the heart. I have this on PDF.
Nice.
Just to give you an idea of the various, what are we looking at? So he looked at me improvising on some of the sounds that he produced. And these are the scores that he created. Can you see it a little bit?
Whoa.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
I know. And then he did things like this. This is called a wall. This is a metaphor, the task called the wall. I know, it's brilliant. So, I mean, this was great, but this was called Two Worlds. You see, so he was looking at me, and as a composer, deviser, he was being inspired, but the inspiration led to a question of scoring, a graphic score that the music became set, but I kept on improvising, which was interesting. The sonic improvisation led to a score and led to a composition, but my side of the equation, because it was studio, for many reasons, remained open. We did a second piece called After All Is Said and Done, and that one, I have no archive of that one. It was during one of those periods where you're busy doing the stuff and doing 25,000 things and you forgot to play record. And that one, we were tasking together, reading each other through performance.
Nice.
Anyway, that to give you an idea. Yes, he saw me move. He would put me on a state of sound which was not yet composed. That impossible sound, which was a tone that we could only, we barely spoke. There's actually a beautiful documentary on that. Does that make sense? So yes, it's
sure.
what are we looking at? And when we take that, so that's what I'm saying, that was a very complex moment of improvisation into scoring, and it was more in studio. But when that was done, the second piece, After All Is Said and Done, was actually an open improvisation, instant composition on stage with the public.
Cool. And
he was on his piano, but also on his, the piano was connected to his electronic stuff. Nice. He was, the start of the task was always known. So the trigger for the task, again, emergent systems, the trigger for the task was not known, but then it would evolve.
Who's the musician?
Kyriakos, I'll put his name on the chat. I'll send you this essay, and I know I have But he's now a curator.
Mm-hmm.
But I have this. I have on that PDF, because I didn't open it, it's just the essay he wrote quite beautifully. But I have this somewhere. I have the scores as well. And in fact, I also have the scores for Mahler, which were quite extraordinary. The music for Mahler, which was on stage, was a beautiful duet from London, very well known, called New Noise Ensemble. And it's Yodi in 32 percussion instruments, you know, very sonorous. Wow. And J&J, oh my God, it was so long ago, on flute.
Nice.
And the score, literally, it was almost like a moment of Xenakis. He was there with the score, the graphic scores, and he was just, I mean, when you see what it was, Jordi is there just reading, playing, and just throwing these pages as he was finishing. And in many ways, and he was visible on stage. And he had a space demarcated with the 32 percussion instruments. So he became part of the choreography. Nice. And it was just beautiful. There was a moment that we allowed just the two of them to improvise. So this is beautiful. You know, it was a dance piece that a middle section was basically just for music. We did that on purpose. The middle point of Mahler's was just for music, no dances, with a lighting that kept changing and putting them in and out of darkness.
Nice.
So yeah, so you see, when we speak about improvisation, at which level of improvisation are we speaking? And I'm really, really interested in sharpening the dancer's skills, that the free improvisation happens while there's also a real clear understanding of instant composition. And when you become very skilled, because you work on this, and this is where you have the equivalent to the jazz improviser, when you become so skilled in this, your memory is extraordinary, because one of the major challenges of free improvs, Peter is very critical, he calls it the love-in. You know, he calls it the love-in. Everybody's loving and rolling and having a great time, and nobody knows what happens at the end. Or the audience feels, why am I here? They're having a great time on stage, but why are we here? You know that sometimes happens. Yeah. Improvisations can become quite enclosed upon themselves, and that's fine. But why bring a public? You know, that's exactly. For me is a question, and hence the participatory stuff that I told you about.
There's a question about that later, also about audience. But sorry, then, well, some. No, it's okay. It's great. Some of the questions you've been answering. Yeah, well, I'm gonna just follow the questions, but I know you've been talking about them, and sometimes maybe the question will be, okay, we've been talking about it, but then just there's a question: how do you feel the relation between dance and music when the music has a steadier beat, such as in popular rhythms, or when it's more experimental and abstract? Do you have any preference regarding style of music to improvise?
This is where being from Puerto Rico comes from, because, and rhythm, because even in something like salsa, particularly the beautiful thing about Caribbean rhythms, which is a little bit like flamenco, which is that the musical rhythm and the dance form have the same name.
Nice. Yeah, we have that in Brazil as well.
Yeah. So think about what that means. When the music and the dance form have the same, you dance salsa because it's salsa movement, but salsa has particular steps. The one that comes directly from Africa, which we mentioned in the score, is bomba. Bomba is, there are steps, and steps have words, and they are little clips that, depending on the dialogue with the musician, you interspersed. What am I saying about that? Is that you can have rhythm, but rhythm still allows a call and response between the dancers and the musicians. It doesn't mean that a rhythm, which we perhaps have more in classical European forms, And I'm going to say that because a good ballet should not actually follow the music. It's the suspension before the fall. It's just that it's taught like this, and a good ballet master should remind you of the tacit. Okay, so
Tacit.
the tacit, the moment of suspension, the moment where there's an almost silence, the dancer has extraordinary options of where they're going to take the movement. So even in rhythm, the tacit allows the body to decide its relationship to stop, to flow, to gravity, and it will determine what happens next. So even when there is rhythm, it doesn't have to be a slave to the rhythm.
Exactly.
It's just that, I mean, I love K-pop. I'm at the moment in love with Korean culture.
Nice.
Way before Netflix. This is old. Only because I once read, again, it's because of the Sonic, I once read that Korean was actually the hardest language for a Westerner to learn. And I
bet.
And then I went like, challenge accepted.
You were learning Korean.
I am still learning because I'm doing it on my own, because in Greece, there's nowhere to go and learn. But of course, the best way to listen, it's about listening. So I listen to K-pop, I don't have Netflix, I have Viki Rakuten to listen to all the Korean. So I've been learning Korean. But all that to say, we know that we have the phenomena of pop, and the pop deals with, I'm going to use the word almost militaristic, which is actually appropriate to the way K-pop industry operates. We must remember that all these things are social metaphors.
Yes.
I live in a very complex, exhausting world inside my head, and I get lost in it regularly. But in many ways, it's the militaristic of the drill. If you look at a lot of the pop choreographies, particularly in the idols, the competitions, and these kinds of things, there's an element of drill, the drill. I'm going to throw the militaristic drill in it, both as a metaphor and as a practice, an invisible social practice within these forms. But that's not the only, and it has become dominant because it's a multi-million industry, et cetera, et cetera. We're not going to go there. But it's not the only response to working with rhythm.
Yes.
So the same with the sonic. You know that many people who work sonically, the sonic is like Bach. It's wallpaper. It's around them. It may be a skin. It provides a sense of container. But there is a strong independence from what happens. Independence, not because it's purposeful, in the case of Cunningham and Cage, because it was independent, but they had constructed the two elements that were independent were very complex.
Yeah.
So the clash or the synthesis of that independence was extraordinary and complex because each was very complex. But when you have just a sonic landscape, which GarageBand allows us to do it with not so much complexity. Everybody's a composer because we all have GarageBand on our iPhones, myself included. And dancers who perhaps have gone through training because they go to studios, but not necessarily because they have gone through vocational training, you end up with an independence of the two things, which is independent because nobody has thought of the possibility of another. It's an accident. And sometimes accidents are great, but I think that Cage and Cunningham, and the other is not even accident, it's just a series of synchronicities, which can easily get exhausted within the short span of a performance. Perhaps if this lasted weeks, we would begin to see the synchronicities elaborating. Complexity, I'm not saying that they're void of complexity, but we don't have the durational time span. to be able to see very simple systems evolving complexity. So when you have a shorter time span, your start point arguably is complex. It already comes with a complexity that then evolves even further. Or my durational work, if you're going to start super basic, then you need durational. You need durational to be able to elaborate complexity. But even that statement requires an understanding of what that origin is, which is accidental. Well, we've kind of done the going out in the streets and dancing and see what happens.
Mm-hmm. There's a question about that, actually.
Does that make sense? Yeah. Does that answer your question? I went to be roundabout, but
yeah, exactly. Yeah, you talk a lot about spaces, and there is a question: what kinds of spaces can be interesting for the practice of free improvisation between music and dance? What external features can improve this experience? Set, costumes, lighting, having or not having an audience. I know you've done all that.
So this is the numbers pieces. I started creating works where I would take prime numbers because I ran out of things to say. I'm joking. Like, really, are we saying things? Well, I'm going to start pieces that don't say anything. And I love mathematics, which is probably why I love music. My mother was going to take me out of ballet classes unless I had all A's.
Really?
So I had all A's, which means I know maths and I know science.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
Not only that, I did the advanced maths and the advanced sciences because I really did not want to be forced out of my ballet class every day. That's a joke. So I love prime numbers. That's just comic relief until I sort out the answer. So I decided to do, since this is 2016, I said, right, from now on, it's all about prime numbers. Why? Complex. Because they are complete, they're not divisible by anything. They are an integrity within themselves. Of course, in mathematics, they acquire, they acquire metaphoric significance depending the roles they play in various mathematical theories. Particularly, I love them when they're relating to spaces in relation to dimensions. That is so beautiful. I understand up to about 9 dimensions, 11 and 13 dimensions. I just kind of wrap my head around that. I've tried. It's like, but I will do that before I grow. So I started with 3, 5 got really interesting. 5 became 5 meters of dance floors, 5 durational in 5 festivals across 5 a year in Athens. And I created 5 minutes of a sound score that was heard with audio equipment. And each 5 minutes was divided into 1 minute, and every minute had 5 layers of sonic edited ambisonically. I did it. I learned how to edit ambisonically. It was the next step. I was going to start composing my own work. That is called Just 5. So it was my improvisation. People were watching me, but we were all independently listening to the headphone. Why is that important? Because then this affects what I learned from the other one. This affects this.
I think I saw a video of that.
People began to see that they had choices in the viewing. People began to see that they were actually composing. People began to see that I'm there in front of them, only 5 meters away, and I appear, but I disappear depending on how the voice was calling them in. So it proved the importance of the sonic, even though I was in front of them for 5 minutes. In 5 meters, they said, we closed our eyes and wanted to listen to you. Yeah, does that make sense? So the participatory, and then there's 7 to the 7th. And then it got so complicated that I passed, you may also want to dialogue with him, Lambros Pigounis. He's, oh no, screen share, sorry, wrong button. I want to chat. and he's collaborating with me. And I think his site is called kinesphere.com or .net. I'll send you his email. He's amazing.
Nice.
Lambros is
Thank
a
you.
sound artist, and he works performing. He put his body through. I mean, he is the genius. I've learned so much with. So he did 7. Dimitris helped me a little bit to tweak 5, but he didn't compose. By the time I did 7, and I wanted 7 minutes, 7 cities, every minute with 7 layers of sound collected by the artists in those cities sending. I went like, this has to be done by someone that can really master this. So 7 to the 7 was a project that happened for 7 days across 7 time zones pre-pandemic, where people could access the score. And the score was a task score for dancers and the public. We wrote it in such a way that the dancers could make it super complicated, but my grandmother could do it on her sofa. Actually, my grandmother didn't do it. She passed, but my mom did in the sofa whilst listening to the scores and watching the performances through the website. So that was an improvisation of the dancers and the people who gathered, and an improvisation of the people watching the pieces remotely, also improvising while watching. I mean, the networks of improvisations were extraordinary. And again, it's interesting, we're all listening to the same score, and we're not listening to the same score because we are listening while we're responding to 50 people who gather in the space, to 100 people that gather in the space. We did it at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation building here in the summer. And the first days, because we were changing the clock according to the cities, when it was 7 o'clock in Miami, it was 4 a.m. in Athens. So that day it was just the dancers and the film guy streaming us. But on Sunday, where it was 7 o'clock in Athens, and we opened it to, it became a diverse platform. We purposely invited dancers with diverse abilities. We still use the word disability. There were like 200 people on this small space, and we were falling into the pond. And at that point, the listening and the dealing with so many people became a metaphor for dance and musical improvisation that I'm still trying to unpack. So that was improvisation, and it was not broadcasted. It was brought into the individual bodies of every dancer participant. And I haven't written about those, you know, the ones that, so basically I now only use this. I did the project in the desert, and I took myself with the words of the women, you know, now I only do this. It was funny because I said I'm never touching the stage, and you know that I was just in Puerto Rico doing a piece on stage, and I liked it, but I'm still going like, it's nice, it's good, it was funny, they flew, I put them on harnesses, a little bit of circus, it was great, they're beautiful dancers, but I'm kind of going like,
yeah.
It was great, you know, it was great to speak to a composer again. And again, we spoke of the sonic, we spoke about the effect of certain sounds. Again, there was a moment that I put 7 news agencies at the same time, speaking in 7 languages. Wow. It was a bit of a post-pandemic, if there's such thing. I call it my purgatory piece. It's like, what have I created? They were in the middle of purgatory. You know, all the other pieces are really lovely and dancey, and there's me with these creatures in black in the middle of all this noise. I'm like, oh yeah, I've been in lockdown in Athens. Anyway, so participatory, yeah, that also makes a difference. How are we listening? What are we listening? And the power of the voice. It's amazing when the sound is voice.
Yes.
We just, you know, we're just hardwired to just, you know, it was me, it was my voice and my body, but because my body was not dancing the voice, there was a dissociation between what they were hearing and what the dance, you know, there was no, I was speaking about Stockholm and Puerto Rico, and they're in Athens. And there's a beautiful moment when they realized they could do this and listen to the real sounds of Athens. I gave no instructions, just to let them discover that they could just do this.
Yeah.
And why don't we think about that? It was such a major revelation. I have 2 earpods, I have to wear both. Like, no, you can. In fact, you can do this, stop the narrative, and put them back on again. It's quite interesting how we deal with these rules that are embedded with technology, well, particularly now, sonic and visual technology. So yeah, I like playing with them.
Yeah, I've been talking to performers. I've been talking to performers who love exploring different kinds of spaces in non-stage, like you do, right?
Non-stage. Yeah.
There's a question here. In your opinion, what's the importance of exercises, warm-ups, and meditation previous to a free improvisation performance? Do you tend to do certain things before you perform, or rehearsal?
Yeah. Two things. I think that there's an element of immersion necessary to improvisation. It may not be an aesthetic immersion, like, punch-drunk theater and that kind of stuff. But I think in attitude and concentration. I always speak of the equivalent would be the athlete who zones in. The zoning in?
Zoning in.
Step on the track.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on what the improvisation is going to be like, I do different strategies because it affects sonically. It's not to create a memory or to start producing, it's to sensitize the body, particularly because we're dealing with potentially two forms that can be seen to be ephemeral. Because I argue that even if it's recorded, there's an ephemerality because of the sequence of sounds that, creates a remembering and forgetting because of the fact that it's in series. Well, anything that is in a series has a remembering and a forgetting. We must remember that. Well, the concept of rhythm remembering is based on that. Mm-hmm. So on stage, it's really funny because it seems to defeat the purpose of collaboration and improvisation. Mm-hmm. But if it's on stage, I go hours before.
Really?
And I'm on stage like a meditation. Mm-hmm. On my own, in a black stage for hours, listening into the silence. To really feel that I've arrived on stage, so that I'm really grounded. So I do that. Mm-hmm. And in fact, sometimes, how sometimes you have to do the technical rehearsal into the show. I walk into the technical rehearsals in the morning and I purposely do not leave the building. Kyriakos and I, during the 2 weeks that we did Unbearable, we were in the studio from 9 to 9 and we did not exit. We were doing our lunch and but we did it on purpose. We knew that there's because we're dealing with the system, the body is a neural perceptive system. We know that the body accumulates and we know that the body creates certain states of concentration by the accumulation of stimulus. Mm-hmm. That's a beautiful thing of certain types of meditation. They're both an emptying and a filling up. It's just an emptying of what to a filling up of what is what we could spend, hours philosophizing, depending on what kind of.
So with Theater and Corpse, your group, you gather once a week, twice a week. Do you have them in a circle? Do you?
No. Now I work on project by project.
Okay.
So, because in Athens funding is super limited. So, but we will then, because methodology is so important, we will decide what the methodology for the work is. Mm-hmm. So it is about being in the space. It always entails being in the space. I go into the space before, mm-hmm. but we always come into the space significantly before, already
makes sense,
scoring the score,
mm-hmm.
yeah, but not necessarily interacting with each other on purpose. So we begin to say, it's like revving, boom, boom, revving the motor, both perceptually and of course warming up, etc., etc. Because I've been working, the company at the moment includes diverse bodies. We can't really do a warm-up together because I'm an older dancer, Demi uses crutches, The others are younger. We don't really do a warm-up together because we have different physical needs.
Yes.
But we do have that shared concentration, the fact that we're listening into the environment. So we will do a series of, actually, most of what we do together are listening tasks and slow, sensitizing to listening. If we're working, the last ones have all been with audio. I forgot to tell you this. Before the films that I did, the 13 variables that I just did, which were 13 sonic interventions in archaeological sites with scores. Again, 13 tasks, it became impossible. From 7 to 13, from 11 to 13, the jump is so big, it's really hard to keep 13 sounds, 13 minutes. It seemed like an hour.
Wow.
But for those, we would just wear, we all agreed to wear the sound from the moment we woke up until meeting in the space.
Wow.
So we just, there is no, what I'm saying, it's just something that we do to mark the moment. It's not necessarily that it has proven to be. For me, this has proven to be. I daydream. It's like the Aboriginal daydreaming. It's with me. I call it my shadow. That sound and the tasks are my shadow through the day, beginning to open a concentration before I then move into the space. And like I told you, the last, 5, 7, 11, and 13, they've all been outside spaces. They haven't been stage spaces. Until then, carrying that into the space. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah. You've been talking about numbers, right? So there's a question: what's the average length of a free improvisation performance? What are the differences between a long and a short one? Well, you've been trying quite a lot of
yeah. I'm really
lengths.
loving the duration. I am really loving the durational now. They're hard because they don't fit in a festival.
Yeah.
But if you can find, I haven't been able to do, what's the longest durational that I've done? Well, I would say that the desert was a month durational improvisation. It's just that publicly it had weekly public moments or broadcasting moments. But that was a month in the desert on myself with the music and the sound and the score and 4 cameras.
That's amazing.
But the durationals I tend to do on my own. The final durational event of that durational performance was 2 hours. And I could have gone for more. It's just that it was 2 hours because we had set 13 repetitions of the 13-minute scores. So it was 2 hours and I didn't feel it. And it was out in the desert in December, freezing cold. Oh, and I would so do it again. I have done more theatrical whole day, you live in but that exists in theater, but it's not really dealing with sound. We know that theater you go into a space and you live in the space for 3 days. And it's a bit like Big Brother is watching you. I'm not really interested in that kind of performative durational stuff. It's just, but when it's music or sound, the longest has been the 2 hours in the desert.
What about really quick ones? Have you tried
5? The 5 was 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Yeah, I've been
and I burn it, it's like a firework, those little stars that you put fire. It feels a little bit like that. Because it's only 5 minutes and you just go, for those I'm really rep because I step and there's not enough time to develop, so you've got to be ready. And it is like those sparkles. That's the metaphor of the 5 minutes. I haven't done less than that because 5 minutes, it's, I could do a minute. Maybe I should try that with my funky films and see what happens. But even if, if I was going to do an opening program, we timed a minute. A minute just states, a minute just states a minute you discover, okay, I discovered this is the improv. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And you just feel that you know, okay, so how can I elaborate that? Okay, maybe you elaborate that in a minute. But again, it would be just the arm improvisation. It wouldn't be the, it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting.
You've been
I'm sure we
talking.
could do a minute. I'm sure we could do 30 seconds, but is it an improvisational form or is it a moment of improvisation? You know.
I see.
But I've done 5 minutes. 5 minutes is the shortest that I would recommend.
Cool. You were talking about that you've been editing and also making your own soundtracks. There's a question: what's your relation with the musical practice? Do you feel that the dancer being able to play an instrument or not makes a difference in the improvisation process?
Interesting. Because I actually don't play. I used to play classical guitar, but you know, because I learned it from my dad, not because of you know, I'm Paco Sanchez or whatever, you know, the guy is. Gypsy Kings. I don't read music, which is really funny. People assume that I read music. I can sort of, you know, I can sort of tell. When I did Mahler, I actually bought the Mahler monographs. But there's something about the densities of scores that, you know, makes sense. It depends, you know, the question of music, which in many ways it happened with moving sounds, is how are those artists been what has their journey with music been? Because many dancers may know piano, but they have a nightmare memory of having learned the piano. Does that make sense? They're not necessarily pianists. I'm gonna offer an alternative to that. So playing the piano doesn't necessarily add automatically. When someone is a musician and a dancer, and there's a beautiful Eleni here in Athens, and she's both, she has a sensitivity in fact, she was part of one of the earlier experimental moments of moving sounds at the studio.
What's her name?
She has Eleni. I'll remember. I know her. We're good friends, but I never remember surnames. I'll send you the link. I can't even remember the instrument she plays anymore, but she just has a sensitivity. Again, she understands open composition almost innately because she does both. Musicians who move a little bit are great because they are less resistant to move away from the script and the podium, you know?
Yeah, I've been trying that.
I did, for many years, I did the research methods at Guildhall School of Music with the music composition students. So I have taught musicians for many years. And that was a lot, you know, there was a lot of discussions on some of them who felt they were both dancers and musicians, and the kinds of experimentations that they were willing to do, particularly in improvisation and the moving and the relationship to instrument, or many of them were also voice artists, vocal artists. So again, if a dancer is also a musician, well, they're also a musician who is a dancer, so that, you know, it's a Mobius strip, isn't it, in that moment. So that's my answer. It depends. It's a question of it's almost specific context of, and also what is the instrument that they play.
Yeah, I played the tambourine, so lately I've been dancing and playing at the same time.
But again, it is in the history of the instrument.
Exactly. Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
There's actually
cello. It's like you can't move with the cello. Although I've seen some cellists trying to move with the cello, and it's just beautiful. Or the impossibility of moving a cello makes it beautifully possible as a moment in choreography, let alone the piano. Although we've known many pieces have moved the piano with the pianist.
There's candomblé here in Brazil, which I heard that there are certain dances which according to the movements, the beat, the conga or the atabaque,
yeah.
right? The drum changes. It's so I've been trying to talk about that in my research, because like you were saying, right? Some genres have either for dance or music, the names
Exactly
they're totally connected, right?
connected. Yeah. But again, you think of congas, they're also conga bongas, bongos, and the larger ones. They are connected to dance forms. They are skin, they're tactile. So, again, it's the nature of the instrument, an instrument that is skin, that is taut, that can have friction, it has bounce, but you can also give it friction with it's like another body. Strings are beautiful. Cello has the tonality of the human voice, viola as well. I'm not so keen on violins anymore. Piano, I love the duration of each and single piano note. And then the speed of Nyman and
I can't remember
so it depends. It really depends.
There's have you seen costumes with music accessories?
Yeah.
That's also something.
And the whole sonic. Yeah.
And there are tons of things. There's a question here. You've been talking about memory. What's the role of memory in the improvisational act during free improvisation performances?
This is where the expertise and the concentration comes in. And I mean the expertise to becoming an expert, just there's a discipline in improvisation. Memory is important, and I think we speak about, I speak about it, or we speak about it. And it's you test your memory, which is one of the things that I've realized is that if I don't think about remembering, but what I think of is the clarity and the depth of perception of each moment, there will be memory. Why? Because memory depends on stimulus impact. The more information any moment has in our perceptual apparatus, meaning that the moment recalls complex sensorial responses in us, the more that we will remember. We also know that touch is an ear. So when the moment is tactile and sonic, for some reason, and remember, skin is the whole body is tact. The whole body is tact. We forget that it's not just hands. There is something about tact and listening that seems to create a very strong memory, or maybe that is in me. I seem to have a tact sonic memory. I don't know why. So memory is important by not thinking about remembering. And again, I'm not being crazy or saying I'm not taking any claim of this, because I am geeky and I've been reading the neuroscience behind this. There is the phenomenological. I have the moving file somewhere. I was organizing my files. And we know that the more, the richer sensorially of every moment of improvisation, literally the more it can go into a system, the more we're available to remember, which then means now you have rhythm remembering. Rhythm not only as a structure, but creating a rhythm of remembering, which allows instant composition to happen. It happens a lot with the scores because, the score was only 5 minutes, but I repeated it 5 times with a 5-minute pause in between. After a while, without noticing certain things, there's always a picture with this hand, with a 5. It never happened with a moment of the score, but I remember Pablo, as a photographer, said there's something that happened because even the photographer wears the sound score when he's shooting, which is quite beautiful. Pablo says there's something about when I see you doing the sequence there's something about seeing how your body is getting ready
Mhm.
that I almost know when that hand gesture is going to happen. It doesn't mean that I memorized it in such a way that this happens in the score and the hand gesture happens, but it's almost like the memory begins to create an open repetition, an open improvisation. It's almost like the memory begins to narrow the elements of the improvisation. Yeah, it's almost like it's like a funnel has happened. It's almost like the improvisation system, it's already, when you take the seed out of the pod, it's already shelling from the moment of improvisation. It's almost like the system is already shelling these bits that it's putting in the bag. And then those things in the bag are allowed to keep generating the new systems. Does that make sense? So that is a kind of memory. That's in studies of memory, that's called reflection in action. And it's one of the, because reflection, which is really what memory is, reflection is always considered as something of the past. You know, it must have happened in the past for it to be a memory. Well, in phenomenology of perception, there's a question which is the hardest, which I speak about it in the introduction of the essay, is the reflection in the moment. You're in the present, but you're already noticing that the present has become captured. Without, how complex is our brain without divorcing you from your focus of the moment? So it actually goes against the myth that if you see yourself dancing, you break the flow. That's not true at all. It's amazing how the body can deal with understanding of these things becoming discrete while you're still in the moment. And that is complex reflection. That is reflection in the moment. That is improvisation becoming a skill. And musicians, I think, know that more than dancers. I think musicians know that more than dancers. But again, it has to do with the nature of your training.
We
Our
always
training
consider,
so different.
should we repeat something like a line or a chunk of sounds? Should we go do it again, or shouldn't we? It's always a dilemma. There's a question. Speaking of that, I'm gonna just put two questions in one, which would be, how do you choose your movements in an improvisation performance, considering your own repertoire? Do you have any techniques or pre-established paths? And also, at the same time, how do you feel about showing virtuosity in high technical skills in a performance? Should it be considered or not?
Two things. And again, it also goes back to this, how improvisation becomes a kind of discipline. And that does not have to be a contradiction. Again, if you understand what the word discipline means, which doesn't mean this. Because of my training in Tanztheater, I know that I will start with the body curve. It always, I can do it. It always starts with. It always. There's something that I didn't notice I did until I started seeing it's which is funny because my father always says memory, history, you never go back to go forward. He's speaking about human mistakes, etc. Para atrás ni para coger impulso. But we do go back. How back to gain momentum to come forward? So I've noticed that I always do that, and now I've accepted it. I don't force it. It seems to come. It almost is like my mantra, my sutra. My mantra finishes with that moment of the inhale into my body, exhale into the space. And this tends to follow. And it's quite lovely, but it's not a technique. It's something that, particularly the work that I've been doing, has begun to create this signature. I would call them like a signature. It's not even a style. It's almost like these signature moments, which serve a purpose in the improvisation, the spark plug.
In your experience with ballet, do you feel that some ballet movements come? Do you avoid them? Do you think it was great for your life now that you're improvising? Like
I don't use the challenges, and I don't do ballet anymore. I can't train in it anymore because I'm older and hips and bones and all those kinds of things. But well taught, it can be quite beautiful. But that in itself raises questions. And again, when you look at the history of what it was, actually ballet was abstract. Narrative ballet is only 60 years of ballet in the 1800s. Ballet was abstract. Ballet was a mathematical, scientific study of the human body. And it's Carlo Bassi's Theatrice on Dance, which is somewhere over there. And it was Louis XIV, who was quite a scary guy. Let's not forget that. Actually, ballet was always about the conquering of nature, because that's what Louis XIV was all about. It was a classicist program on the body. So that's why I have difficulties with some aspects of that. Although as a child in Puerto Rico, it was what allowed me to dance. So if that's what I need to do in order to dance, that's what I would do. Although prior to ballet, I would just put music and literally improvise, saying that I was Charlie Chaplin with a cane underneath my. For some reason, I had film and dance for me have always been connected. My images of dancing are watching Charlie Chaplin films in silent and me dancing to them, which is why probably Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton are my, those 1930s, 1940s film experiments are really what is behind my experimental work at the moment. It really is to Jean Cocteau and all those guys that they're emerging through the work with film now. So I can't say ballet movements in terms of the language of ballet does not appear. That people see a balletic, I am very tall for a dancer. I am 5'9". That's not necessarily very tall, but Latin American women, 5'9" for a Latin American woman is tall. For Puerto Rican woman is super tall.
5'9", what would be in
1'6", 1'6", 1'6", in point shoes, I'm 6 feet. That's a men's height.
Yes.
So what people always say, which I wasn't, and my body is very classical. I have a short torso, which is why I probably never did Graham. Graham was very short with a very long torso. The technique is not universal. It's meant for short people with long torsos. So I do have, I have an affinity with ballet because my instrument has an affinity with ballet. I have very long limbs, ridiculously long limbs, very short torso, super long legs. But the problem with ballet is that I did not like the roles of the women. They're slow and painful and horrific. The adagio. I wanted to do the gran allegros with the guys. I wanted the jump, which is probably the Puerto Rican, tomboy girl. I wanted to do the jumping thing with the guys, and I had to do the painful stuff with the girls. So, although the arabesque penché, the arabesque penché always comes in, the dying swan. I will always, there's some things that I always do, like the dying swan. Slightly, there's a moment of dying swan, which I do on purpose. It's almost like a conversation with myself as I am in improv. So the arms, there's something about the there's something in the way that the port de bras of my arms happen, that even when they have a contemporary shape, people go like, you still have a lyricism. People speak about a lyricism in my arms, which I'm just going to accept. There were 30 years of ballet inscribed on this body. We have to acknowledge what 30 years of bodily inscription does to your sense of, you can't just say, it's not just I'm changing my shirt or dyeing my hair, I have a new identity. It's inscribed in layers of my body, which I can't even understand. And probably even the music sensitivity comes from my understanding. I was lucky to have fantastic ballet teachers in the island of Puerto Rico, and also they knew, they understood music, they understood what music was to the ballet discipline. So probably my affinity to listening, even when I work with composers that did more neoclassical pieces, but I continue to work with ballet companies. So except this one, which is an insane purgatory noise piece, with this beautiful young man, Gabriel Rivera, who is a genius, that I just met him and said, like, you're composing with me. For the ballet company, I always opted for neoclassical. It was just a compromise that I did with the ballet companies in Puerto Rico. To be able to push the movement vocabulary to something more contemporary. It took me years for the company not to wear shoes.
Wow.
To wear barefoot. So the music was a little bit of a, a good compromise. So those compositions tended towards the neoclassical, they sounded like Nyman, they sounded like Richter, they sounded like Goretzky. Those are my classical, neoclassical, contemporary classical references. Nyman more than Glass, Richter, of course, who doesn't like Richter nowadays? But definitely Goretzky and Kieslowski. Again, but they're connected to the filmic, being quite, and of course Barrington Furlong, who was again very connected to the filmic. So that comes from ballet. All that to say, that is ballet in me. So that sensitivity to understanding structure, even within improvisation, that comes from.
Yeah.
My not being afraid of structure comes from ballet in ways that contemporary dancers, you mentioned the word structure and you feel that you have taken their freedom from there, which probably comes from not very good education, but complexity can be so understandable. We think that complexity is difficult. They're two different things. I always say that my work is making complexity accessible, and I don't mean complexity. We can understand complexity. That's why we learn to add first, to subtract later, to multiply and divide in a particular order. That's just ways in which complexities of understanding things is made possible. And for some reason, dance has this naive, infantile attitude that structure is some sort of fascist imposition. Simple. Simplistic, not simple, simplistic. Anyways, that's ballet. So that's ballet and my work. Virtuoso, absolutely. I mean, 7 to the 7th. That's why we had the score, the task scores, be able to be read. I need to send, because I don't think, unfortunately, the beautiful website that contained all the information of 7 to the 7, we just didn't have the funding to keep the website open for more than 2 years. So I could send you, the task of 7, move with 7 parts of your body. Well, that allows the dancer to be as virtuoso as they want, moving 7 parts of their body. They just can't do it automatically. It's not an auto, and this is the answer to the question. It's not an automatic display of virtuosity, which a lot of contemporary dance in its freedom has become a new virtuoso. Contact improvisation has become a new virtuoso. People all want to look like Russell Maliphant or Robert Oloyan. I know them both. They won't be offended by that statement. The flying of David Zambrano. It's like it's become, how many things, how bendy can I be? Even contemporary dance has become a constant display of virtuoso, but it becomes an automatic display of virtuoso. It's become a technique. It's become a rigid value of what is good dance or bad dance, and that's supposed to be anathema to what contemporary dance was. So in many ways, we're suffering from a virtuosity of contemporary dance at the moment. So automatic virtuosity, I would go like, yeah, why is this here? It makes no sense. Virtuosity that comes because the body is that skill and understand the possibility of that virtuosic response to what the improvisation moment offers, absolutely, why not? but that in itself is not, it's a virtuosity of a virtuosity.
Yeah.
Because it's not an automatic display of virtuosic physical skills.
Mm-hmm.
How can you go into automatic virtuosity skills and still be committed to the moment of improvisation? You're just waiting for the moment of doing your, your big moment. At that moment, improvisation collapses. It's become a series of solo performances synchronically, which you have a lot in improvisation. When you end up with a lot of solos, a virtuoso of solos, and there's no connection between any of them. They're just looking for the open moment to display skills. That is not improvisation. That is something perverse, just to call it improvisation. Perverted. Sorry, not perverse, perverted. I'm very careful with my words, probably because second language, that I've used the right tense, because they can
say perverso, né? Pervertido.
Perverso, una perversión, you know what I mean. Una perversión, una perversión. An inversion of the very aims and visions of improvisation.
Yeah, like trying to show off.
Exactly. I mean, inevitably, improvisation is about collective negotiations. That's why it is so complex, and that's why it has been used in so many cases for the politics of contemporary dance. But so the moment that politics becomes a display of virtuosity, we have a method, in PhDs, we would say you have a methodological glitch. You have a methodological contradiction. And that for me is something to continue to work, to understand. How do we improvise? How do we create structures that are not methodologically inconsistent with the very notion of improvisation? If we say improvisation is a practice of freedom, that there are some books in about dance and improvisation as a practice of freedom. What does that mean? And are we inadvertently working against the very freedom that we propose? Is there such thing as freedom? We just came out of the pandemic, and then suddenly there's Putin. Hello. We should all improvise. Sorry, I'm an artist in my time, and it's,
sad times.
It's a challenging times. Sad as well.
There's a last question, actually. I'm gonna wrap up in two questions in one again. Let's go. How do you see the emotional aspect in free improvisation? And also, I don't know if you can answer at the same time, but how do you feel about silence in improvisation performances?
Emotion, I think it's always there if you really understand what emotion means, not sentiment. When we go through physical states, there are changing emotional responses. Sorry. And in many ways, going back to what we were saying about bodies and spaces and their behavior. So therefore, if it's about bodies, and these bodies have conditions of training, of histories, of personalities, and they're coming into the space. And this space is conditioned by sound, by artifacts, by traffic, and they begin to interact. The behavior, the movement, the act that comes out of that relationship will be emotionally filled because it has been conditioned by the dynamics of that variable. Which is why I would argue that neutrality, physical neutrality, which is sometimes spoken about in improvisation, is a potential methodological glitch. And this is what I was joking about, silence and the North. I was in Stockholm doing a very difficult, physically demanding piece. And someone made the comment of, but there is so much drama in the face. Because contemporary dance is supposed to be, we're all Zen, and that's not cultural appropriation. And I told them, you have a PhD in dance? Well, I'm going to challenge you. Because have you ever seen a weightlifter and his face when they lift weights? Are they angry? Are they sad? no? But the face is fully engaged in something that is the dynamics that come from body and apparatus.
Mm-hmm.
I think that when you're immersed in that body space relationship, it doesn't mean that you are evoking memories from your past and that's making you happy or sad. The relationship between a body that is not neutral and an environment that is charged will have the same effect, will create tension, which will be read as a changing emotional state. And yes, they are. And when I did Mahler, one day, because she's never me, Mahler finishes with she exiting. She's tired of this. She leaves the stage door open, and it was the huge cave of the Bonnybird Theatre in London. And Daniel stays still improvising until he literally, the task was you stop when you're exhausted and you cannot move anymore. Yeah. So I had to end when I said enough. I had to keep the word enough in my head. And when it was enough, I would leave. Daniel was not going to think about anything, but just concentrate on being physically exhausted. Yeah. At the end of that performance, I think we both cried. But it wasn't sadness. It was, but it was an emotional response to the conditions that we had set upon the improvisation. Exhaustion will make the body get rid of whatever is left, and that can be tears, but it's not sadness. It's just an excess of emotion, an excess of something that becomes seen, that is seen as sadness. But it was just the act of crying, which you don't, not even crying, just
relief,
sweat and water. It was literally like every pore of our body was getting rid of energy, and we were drenched in sweat, and tears were coming down. So that's what I mean about what do we mean by emotion. Does that happen in improvisation? Absolutely. An improvisation can elate you, an improvisation can leave you exhausted. I think those fluctuations of what we would call being emotional states can happen at the end of an improvisation, and particularly if the improvisation is durational, you will meet that landscape of fluctuating emotions. But think about it. We know that a marathon runner goes through those fluctuating emotions. It's just that they don't allow themselves to stop. My favorite writer, Haruki Murakami, has a beautiful book about the things that he thinks about when he's what do we write about when we think about running? Something like that. And it's a beautiful relationship between running marathons, which he does, because that's what you do when you're Haruki Murakami. He actually trains to run marathons, but he's a writer. And when he has actually created this beautiful story verbalizing the ups and downs of his marathon running. Nice. So that's a parallel. We just forget that extensive activity will have that ebb and flow of what we would call emotion. So silence is something that I seek within those moments. See, I remember silence. Where a silence is for me my tacit, both a silence of the space or the tacit that I give myself, even within a very loaded sonic environment. Although we know that we can't shut off listening, how do we focus in such a way that I'm trying to regain balance before never leaving the space, but how do I find a moment of tacit, let's call it silence, either because there's silence in the space or because the space is very full and I need to find some sort of internal, let's call it internal silence for the improvisation systems to gain, remember you have multiple systems in improvisation doing this. So where do I feel I need to find this again? Never stopped, so that a new impulse can happen. Does that make sense? So that is silence. Silence is something that I crave, but I don't have. No, but I do it. I do the internal tacit. People accuse me of being a lone wolf, which I am. I will go days just here until I feel I'm ready to go out and do what I need to do. This is something, well, particularly when you're in planes and teaching. So the music improvisation tacit applies to balancing the improvisation that is being a freelance artist in this world. That summed all the strands of the discussion.
Well, Ana, thank you very much for being here.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it was great. Do you have any words, any comments you would like to say?
Yeah, we have to keep listening into the silence. One of the no, because I'm gonna get philosophical, but everybody accuses me of being that as well. The piece in Puerto Rico that I just did is very loaded sonically. And I said to the dancers who were like, this is so hard. This is just not what we're used to performing. I'm like, I know. And I said to them, how do we listen into this so that we can forge a future together? So that for me sort of summarized. The choreography is fixed, but it came out of a process of improvisation because they wanted something new. I was like, okay, we're going to start from zero. And in 2 weeks, we're going to have a 30-minute piece because it's possible. And even though we have to fix it because it has to fit in an evening of performances, you're going to keep that improvisational listening to each other, even at the moment of performing, reiterating the piece. So it was last night that they opened and I had a beautiful message and they said it made sense. The listening into the moment. Yeah, it's although I talk a lot because I'm being asked to talk and that gets confused with what I do a lot, particularly as a teacher, which is to listen to a lot, the room, the energies, before knowing what to do. And I think in improvisation, that is sometimes needed. I'm going to bring it to improvisation, to bring the philosophy to improvisation, to listening and to seeing before saying or acting. And I think that is actually important in improvisation, the listening. Even when it's a silent improvisation, the listening before the doing, and hence the on that note, I won't say anymore.
That's great. I'm gonna stop the recording now and we can have a little chat.
And
then well, thank you very much.